I feel confident that they will have success in regaining more of their territory, and I think it's also important to note that for Russia, this is already a strategic failure.
They're going to pick 2 or 3 places in mass, overwhelming combat power to penetrate, to get all the way to Azov Sea, to break the so-called land bridge that connects Crimea to the rest of Russia. I think they'll leave the Kerch Bridge up for a while so that Russians who want to leave can leave. But then at some point, of course, when this is all done, they'll drop that bridge. But for now, what's important is to isolate it by breaking the land bridge. That, I think, is the objective of this counteroffensive.
To reach the coast and cut Crimea off from the rest of Russia. Unfortunately, for that plan, there's the Crimean Bridge. There's also a major port here that Russia was using to supply Crimea before the bridge was completed. There are also ports and airports all across the peninsula that can be used to move people and goods of all kinds, including in support of a military operation. People have to remember that Russia has been maintaining a very significant military operation in Syria using just their ships and their strategic airlift. So keep that in mind in regards to Crimea, which is much closer than Syria.
Now what does it look like? It will be what we call combined arms. Tanks, mechanized infantry, engineers that are necessary to clear the path, artillery that's able to move and focus to protect this penetration, which may only be 10 or 20 kilometers wide. But it doesn't have to go on for years. It could all end this year.
I think that the offensive is going to be much more successful than many of the more pessimistic analysts have been offering. I think that the Ukrainians are very much ready for this. They'll be very distinctive because they will be employing Western tanks, Western infantry fighting vehicles, Western wheeled armored vehicles, and so forth.
They have been training and practicing how to penetrate Russian defenses. Trench lines, obstacles, minefields, the so-called dragon's teeth, all of that.
You have systems that throw a line charge over a rough path in the minefield. It explodes. It's supposed to detonate and clear out, again, a rough path through the minefield. Then armored vehicles with plows and flails will work through there to attempt to detonate or clear any of the mines the line charge missed. Then the tank with the line charge, depending on how wide this minefield is, has to go down that path to the end of the path, shoot another line charge, and the process continues. And they have to continuously do that until they've cleared a path in the minefield. A tank with a roller comes in and proofs the path to make sure that there are no mines remaining. Means that Russia has a much larger number and variety of weapon systems that can target that minefield that Ukraine can do nothing about. They're going to have to cross the minefield under fire. Russia has, again, huge amounts of artillery. General Zaluzhny himself says that they're outgunned 10 to 1.
I think this is going to happen. And I think that there's going to be considerable success.
I don't think anybody's thinking about right now taking the whole country back, but major gains.
The Ukrainians are very well prepared, as you know very well, the United States and other allied countries in Europe and really around the world. They provided training and ammunition and advice, intelligence, etc. to the Ukrainians. We're supporting them.
This is no longer a coherent force. This is Russian regular army forces that are no longer the original units they were. They've been replaced several times. They're not coherent, cohesive, trained, equipped, etc.
Ukrainian soldiers and Ukrainian people have much more will than do the Russian soldiers and Russian people. Russia's defense industry is in tatters. I think you should ask, do the Russians have the stamina to keep going? I'm not sure they do.
I think the Russians will prove to be more brittle than the expectation is. Keep in mind, these units have been in combat for over a year, many of them. They have not been pulled offline to reconstitute by having forces replaced.
And key point of it is getting the Russian which is pretty shaky in a lot of places, do they melt down in the face of Ukrainian determination and good attacks as they did outside Kyiv and they did outside Kherson? So that psychological piece is huge.
This war has been going on obviously since 2014, and Russia still only controls about 15% of Ukraine. 9 months in Bakhmut, they still haven't captured it, with all the advantages. They still don't have air superiority.
They also don't have army reserves. These are the reasons that I think when these new armor brigades and largely equipped with Western tanks and infantry fighting vehicles generate combined arms effects, that they are going to bring about the collapse, the crumbling at the very least, and very likely the collapse of Russian forces.
Still haven't figured out a coherent command structure. The Black Sea Fleet does nothing except shoot missiles against fixed targets, apartment buildings. The Russians have not been able to destroy one single train or convoy bringing equipment and ammunition from Poland. How is that? In 14 months, they don't have the ability to destroy one train?
They just get individual replacements to fill the gap. They're not well trained, they're not well equipped, they're not well led. And I think that these Ukrainian forces, which are well trained, are well equipped, we are going to break through. And then you might see a real dynamism to the battlefield that could give real opportunities to the Ukrainians to exploit.
People out there in the countryside, this is a society-wide fight that the Russians never imagined in their arrogance and disdain toward the Ukrainians back in February last year when they launched. They never imagined it. So they tried to hit with a baseball bat a nest of hornets, and they're living it now.
The Ukrainian Air Force, which of course has been severely outnumbered from the beginning, but yet the Russians have never been able to get air superiority, which is, I think, a reflection not on math, but on their professional capability.
The Ukrainians have really perfected their air defenses. They're taking down every drone and every cruise missile.
They will be, and the Russians are down. It's the best money we've ever spent. Thank you so much. Now listen.
Even as you plan for the counteroffensive, which we have been working on with you for some 4 or 5 months.
Kremlin often claimed it had the second strongest military in the world, and many believed it. Today, many see Russia's military as the second strongest in Ukraine.
Have provided unprecedented military support to Ukraine. 9 brigades, which now are well-trained, well-equipped, and well-manned. And this is what makes them, what provides them with the military support and the capabilities they need to retake more territory.
The country is failing on the battlefield. Their economy is failing at home as we tighten the stranglehold of sanctions. And the image.
But the aggressor has already dramatically failed. Ukraine has resisted the attack and is fighting back successfully.
So all the indicators I see, the only advantage that they have is they're willing to expend tens of thousands of lives pushing them into a meat grinder. That's not sustainable.
He, of course, very publicly denied any involvement, and I cannot imagine that he would do that if there was Ukrainian involvement. And so the real question in my mind is, was this just one more example of Russian incompetence? Because there were reports last week of some issues with that dam. There's so much water behind it and so forth. There were cracks or what have you. Or did they literally blow the dam up? Thinking that somehow this might delay the offensive or disrupt it in some way, but I don't think that that is going to be the case.
Does it seem believable to you that Russia would destroy a dam and flood ethnic Russian villages and cut off the water supply to Crimea? I mean, that doesn't seem logical. It seems about as logical as blowing up one's own pipeline, doesn't it?
We've come to no conclusions on this. We're working with the Ukrainians. We'll try to get as much information as we can.
Today's day and age of open source media and intelligence, there's a website that actually tracks absolutely confirmed, verified destruction of, say, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles. Just the tanks alone confirmed. And again, this is confirmed by photograph with metadata that so you you ensure that you don't double count, etc.
Open source intelligence, which is essentially couch potatoes, sitting at home, looking at unverified pictures and like somebody reading tea leaves or throwing chicken bones on the ground and trying to discern what's going on that way. They are making these proclamations about Russia and its losses in Ukraine and how well Ukraine is doing.
Just confirmed well over 2,000 tanks lost. I'm sure that there's probably another many hundreds, if not another 1,000 that just aren't confirmed in the way that they have. It's called oryx.com, by the way, for those that want to visit. I think it's a Dutch firm, is a Dutch America. I'm very proud of that.
So it's this one. Oryx is the one I see people citing all the time. Attack on Europe, documenting equipment losses during the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. Okay, destroyed 220, damaged 6, abandoned 41, captured 182. And then for Ukraine, tanks right here, 38. Say that Russia isn't suffering losses. They are. I think probably not as few losses as Russia is claiming, but definitely not as many losses as this website is claiming. Obviously, Ukraine lost many more tanks than just 38. And a lot of the tanks they're claiming Russia lost are actually very most likely Ukrainian tanks. Or else, why would they be begging for more tanks?
So the losses they've sustained have been enormous. They're bringing old tanks out of mothballs, essentially, out of storage, refurbishing them, pushing them into the battlefield.
Dan, it would be very premature to put any estimates of how long time on an operation of this magnitude. There are several 100,000 Russian troops dug in and prepared positions all along the front line, and Ukraine has begun their attack, and they are making steady progress. This is a very difficult fight. It is a very violent fight, and it will likely take a considerable amount of time and at high cost. But at the end of the day, as Napoleon once said, the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. And the Ukrainian morale, their leadership, their skill, their tenacity, their resilience is very high. The Russians, on the other hand, their leadership is not necessarily coherent. Their troops' morale is not high. They've been sitting in defensive positions. Many of them don't even know why they're there. So we'll see. It's too early to tell, but we'll see how this plays out.
It was a war of attrition. It's not a war of territorial conquest. So if your offensive is aimed at simply grabbing territory and not at actually changing any of the conditions that are causing you to lose this war of attrition, then as soon as your offensive ends, no matter where on the map it ends, if it doesn't end in Moscow with the complete destruction of the Russian military, then Russia's going to have the advantage still. It has been sitting around up until and including right now, waiting for NATO to transfer another army's worth of equipment to them. They have been struggling to train up another army's worth of manpower. After this offensive, they're going to be right back in the same position, and NATO, each time they do this, they are less and less able to effectively replace these losses.
But mainly when they have done enough training and they have built up the logistics, and I think we're going to see an attack that will be very professional, very effective, and its purpose will be to, I believe, isolate Crimea and set the conditions for the eventual liberation of Crimea later this year.
Later this year. Just quickly before we go, I'd like to pick up on what you just said there, General Hodges, because you have, in general, been very optimistic about Ukraine's ability to repel the Russian invasion and even march on Crimea. Earlier, a couple of months ago, you said that you expected that to happen by summer. Do you stand by that?
Yeah, by the end of August, Ukraine will have been able to liberate Crimea if, and I've always included this caveat, if we provide them the long-range precision weapons that they need to do that. Yes, absolutely, they can do that.
An exam We're not grading Ukraine's counteroffensive and saying, you did well based on what we gave you, or you did poorly. What we want to do is support Ukraine to make as much progress as possible on the battlefield so that it is in the strongest possible position at the negotiating table. And we do believe that this counteroffensive will allow Ukraine to take strategically significant territory back from Russia, areas occupied by Russia that are rightfully.
If Russia or Belarus, or a proxy of Russia, explodes a nuclear device inside of Ukraine to stop the counteroffensive or to try to break the will of the Ukrainian people, such an attack should be considered an attack on NATO itself. We're of the belief that a nuclear weapon unleashed in Ukraine would irradiate large portions of Europe where we have NATO allies. The counteroffensive is moving slowly but steadily. I applaud President Biden for putting on the table that the threat of Putin using a nuclear weapon in Ukraine is real. And our message is to those around Putin that if you do this, if you follow his order, if he ever gives it, you can expect a massive response from NATO, and you will be at war with NATO.
We're at a bit of a stalemate. We do see incremental gains by Ukraine as they commit to this counteroffensive over the summer, but we haven't seen anything to really help them break through, for example, to drive to the Crimea. It's interesting to me, we tend to focus on some of the munitions that the West provides to Ukraine as they fight this out. And we look at some of them as holy grails as they play out. So if you think of HIMARS, certainly that led to some sensational tactical events. And then you see the Storm Shadow missile doing the same thing. And now we're talking about dual purpose, improved conventional munitions or cluster bombs. None of these, unfortunately, are the holy grail that Ukraine is looking for that I think will allow them in the near term to break through.
And if you look at F-16s, 10 F-16s $1 billion, you add the sustainment cost another $1 billion, so you're talking about $2 billion for 10 aircraft. The Russians have 1,000 fourth and fifth generation fighters. So if you're going to contest Russia in the air, you're going to need a substantial amount of fourth and fifth generation fighters. So if you look at the cost curve and do the analysis, the smartest thing to have done is exactly what we did do, which is provide a significant amount of integrated air defense to cover the battle space and deny the Russians the airspace.
Everybody's focused on the F-16s, the fighter jets, but do remember that as of this moment, Ukraine still has less ammunition than Russians. So when we talk about counteroffensive, going on counteroffensive, if you have less ammunition, is extremely difficult. That is why it takes so long. So fighter jets are still not there, and they will not be there for at least half a year, I guess. But do remember that other stuffs are still crucially important, even if all the attention is focused on the fighter jets.
And then on the ground, yes, the Ukrainian counteroffensive did not achieve what we all had hoped, and I certainly was wrong in my I overestimated what they would be able to accomplish, but still, after these 9 years and almost 320,000 Russian soldiers killed and wounded and thousands of vehicles lost, and this is where we are. So I think that the key here is for the United States, Germany, to do what UK has done, provide long-range weapons capability. Let's get these F-16s into combat here, probably around early summer, and I think the Ukrainians will regain the initiative.
Offensive has not gone. Ukraine started the special military operation out with an air force, and it was destroyed. And any aircraft that NATO transfers to Ukraine are going to be less effective because the pilots will not have nearly enough time to train on them and become effective operating them. They will never exist in numbers larger than what the Air Force started out with in February last year. And these planes are just as prone to being shot down by Russian air defense systems and their own military aviation. And
on as well as planned. The Russians are fighting back better, harder, smarter. What can you tell us about all this?
Well, first of all, I think one of the key factors I'm watching for is, do the Russians actually crack and crumble at some point? No plan survives contact with the enemy. The Ukrainian plan did not. They had to adjust from armored breaching. The minefields are just much longer, deeper than anyone realized. Used infantry squads. That means you're going to gain 100, 150 meters a day as opposed to several meters if you get a breakthrough. No, I think it's accurate to say that the hopes for the counteroffensive had not been fully realized, but it's not over, and they're still driving to be able to cut that key line of communications that comes in from Russia along the southeast and southern coast.
There are reports of illegal cluster bombs and vacuum bombs being used by the Russians. It's illegal and potentially a war crime.
It would be. I don't have any confirmation of that. We have seen the reports. If that were true, it would potentially be a war crime.
Or relating to munitions, and they're running out of that ammunition, and we're low on it. And so what I finally did, we took the recommendation of the Defense Department to, not permanently, but to allow for, in this transition period where we get more 155 weapons, these shells for the Ukrainians, to provide them with something that's a very low dud rate. It's about I think it's 150, which is the least likely to be blowing, and it's not used in civilian areas. They're trying to get through those trenches and then stop those tanks from rolling. And so, but it was not an easy decision, and we're not signatories to that agreement.
Actually, the biggest issue with the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the south, and that takes time, that takes effort, because our army is truly trying to do everything possible to save lives. Unfortunately, it's of course not always can be done, but that is the major effort. So the line of defense that the Russians have built have been extremely well fortified, and that is why it took so long for Ukraine to breach through those lines of defenses.
And I want to point out this. This is from globalsecurity.org, a very good resource for in-depth military matters. And this is U.S. Army Field Manual 161. Armor and Mechanized Based Opposing Forces, Force Operational Art. And if you scroll down, you are going to see a diagram here of the various layers of defenses that are not entirely dissimilar from what Russia is using. And right now, Ukraine is fighting in this first layer, the security zone, the forward edge defensive line. Here they identify it as the security zone, and then there's several actual defensive lines. And as you saw, according to the New York Times, it's not as simple as in these diagrams. It extends all the way back to Crimea, all the way to the coast, all the way back to Papasnaya. There is a huge amount of men and equipment that Ukraine is going to have to get through in order to reach whatever its objective is. Ukraine has to break through the security zone just to get up to these defensive lines, and then they have to work through each and every single one of these defensive lines. And as they're doing this, they become more and more committed to wherever it is they're trying to punch through. Russia can commit more and more of its mobile reserves to that area. Now, there is a possibility that Ukraine is doing this, and as Russia moves in mobile reserves to deal with this intense fighting, Ukraine might take another force and try to hit some place they think is now under defended. That all remains to be seen. Launched along the more than 1,550 armored vehicles, 230 tanks, and other equipment. Ukraine's allies have sent vast amounts of ammunition and also trained and equipped more than 9 new Ukrainian brigades. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said, "Well, we can see what is taking place now on the front line, and it shouldn't surprise anyone. Yes, they received NATO training, but they received abbreviated NATO training, weeks instead of months, or even perhaps years, which would have been required to prepare an army for this type of operation. Not only that, these 230 tanks aren't 230 of the same type of tank. As I pointed out many times before, it's a wide variety of tanks, everything from Soviet-era tanks to German to British to American tanks, and the same story for the armored vehicles. It's a huge variety of equipment. They all have different guns, which require different ammunition. They have different maintenance, sustainment, logistics, and training requirements. So you have a huge variety. The reason a military standardizes is to streamline all of this, because whoever streamlines it the best is going to perform the best on the battlefield. Russia does not have this problem. Ukraine has this problem on a scale that I don't think so. Even if everything goes their way from this point onward. Wherever their offensive ends, once Russia moves their reserves to wherever it is that they reach, they will be wiped out. And there is nothing left for Ukraine. There's nothing that NATO has left to transfer to Ukraine to sustain current combat operations right now. All Russia wants to do is destroy as much of the Ukrainian military as possible, even if it means giving up some territory. They have done that. They will do that again because they know at the end of the day, this attrition is having an accumulative effect, and eventually there's going to be a general collapse of Ukraine's fighting capacity. Ukrainian force that NATO is struggling more and more to help replace those losses.
I feel confident that they will have success in regaining more of their territory, and I think it's also important to note that for Russia, this is already a strategic failure.